welcome to this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network, and today in studio we have Josh Amaral, who is the Assistant Executive Director of PACE, which stands for People Acting in Community Endeavors.
Very good.
Nobody actually knows the name, though, what it stands for. They just know it as PACE after all these years.
That's it.
We have Josh in here, though, to talk about, I want to make sure I get this right, too. He is the chair of the New Bedford Homeless Service Providers Network, and our topic for today is sort of the homeless crises that's going on in the city and in the state, all around. Actually, I know there's there's homeless in small towns and homeless in cities. It certainly doesn't happens everywhere, I guess.
Yeah.
And Boston's had a big issue, and I know with Boston and the Mass and Cass issue that they started cleaning up this week.
Yeah,
has been a big thing. But thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. I know it's a topic that obviously you're very focused on in your role as the chair. Let me ask you, what does the network do?
Sure, it's a great question. So the Homeless Service Providers Network has been around for the last few decades. It's really a combination of all the homeless service provider agencies in the community, and then a lot of other entities that are either supportive of that work, do some kind of work overlapping with some government leaders, some political leaders, and other institutions throughout that all kind of come together, meet monthly, sometimes a little bit more often, to take up all the homeless issues in the city, really. So it's part of this thing called the Continuum of Care, which is really language thrown out there by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And a lot of the funds that come to the city to combat homelessness require these different structures and these different partnerships to exist. So all of that kind of runs through the Continuum of Care, which we call the New Bedford Homeless Service Providers Network. Last count, I think there was over 70 different agencies and organizations that were part of the group, and we meet monthly, come together and talk about those issues. And we also have an executive committee made up of some of the agencies that are really on the front lines to sort of, dive into this policy stuff and figure out what we should be working on. So throughout the course of the year,
there's so many different aspects of it.
Yeah, it's a complicated business, but I mean, it's an important topic, obviously, and there's no easy answers to it. We talk every few years. There's a new plan to eliminate homelessness. And for whatever a century running now, there's been these ongoing plans to eliminate homelessness, and I think the way our society is structured maybe makes it a little difficult to eliminate it. We can reduce it. We can put things in place to try to alleviate the burdens of that and make sure that everybody has a home that they deserve to live in. But there are societal factors that make it difficult. So when you kind of plug one hole over here, there's spring a leak over here, and unfortunately there's really real consequences for a lot of people, and it requires a complicated and intensive response. So we've got people that do homeless outreach, going and finding encampments and finding people that might be sleeping in their cars or on the street and getting them connected with services through shelter services, through finding apartments and getting people like first, last security and assistance just getting into their units, and everything in between, substance abuse treatment. There's providers, part of the network, that do that work, people who do basic needs stuff, legal services, mental health. It runs the gamut. So really, when you see homelessness, it's sort of a symptom of these larger problems and a combination of them. So it requires a combination of different experts, I guess you would say, to solve.
People who watch our channels here, I'm sure, are familiar with the point-in-time count that happens every January, because we always cover the kickoff.
Yep.
And then afterwards, after a couple weeks, we'll always get the results of that point-in-time count. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably the only thing they see about it. How many are out there homeless, families, and what have you. I guess one of the things that I'm curious at is how big a problem or how big an issue is this right now in New Bedford?
Yeah, this is a point of sort of constant debate, I guess, because different people have different perceptions, right? The point-in-time count numbers, I think, have been illuminating over the last few years in revealing the actual number of like on-street homeless folks.
And folks in shelters.
And it counts people in shelters as well.
Right.
I think, you hear a lot of debate over how the city or how we should all deal with sort of panhandling and all that. And really, it sort of amplifies the homelessness problem because people assume that the two are related and that this is a huge issue. And certainly it is a huge issue for the individuals that experience it, but the numbers of people experiencing actual on-street homelessness are usually a little bit lower than most assume, but the number of people that are experiencing homelessness in some form, whether that's a family that's doubled up with another family in an apartment, or someone that's sleeping in a car that might not be identified necessarily, or someone who's just got a housing situation that's not stable, that they can't rely on, particularly families with young children. You got to think about the effects that has on a student's education to not know where they're sleeping tonight. A lot of those different things kind of mount up and create a larger problem. And I think over the last couple of years, really, especially in the last year and a half, we've seen a rise in rents, a rise in home prices, and that's altered sort of the housing market in New Bedford and made homelessness, unfortunately, a little bit more prevalent in populations of the city that you wouldn't imagine. There are people who work full-time jobs who do not have a fixed nighttime residence to go back to at the end of the day. There's, it could be the person, at the drive-through window that you get your coffee from every morning on your way to work. It could be the lady working the desk at your doctor's office when you go to check in. You don't really know who they are. They're pretty convincing about making sure that you don't know what's going on in their lives. But these are all folks that are impacted by our housing situation, and are if they're not experiencing homelessness, they're sort of on the brink of it or at risk of it. And COVID has really only made those things worse.
Right. Is there a better way to find out how many people are in the situation? Because it seems like the point in time is the only thing that people, and that's done not just in New Bedford, but it's done everywhere.
Yep, it's sort of a nationally scheduled thing in every continuum of care. Every HSPN kind of does their own version of it. Last year it was done a little bit differently than it has typically been done in previous years. In an ordinary year, the city is sort of like set up like a grid, in areas where the homeless are known to kind of congregate, are explored and kind of navigated, and you try to make contact with everybody that's out there and get a little bit of information about them, and they get recorded in the system so that we can keep those statistics. Last year, with COVID being what it was a little bit more difficult to get out there and have that face-to-face contact, so it really relied less on sort of this broad network of volunteers and this broad kind of community effort to search, and it was left with the people who do the homeless outreach work every single day. They know where the encampments are, they know where people are more likely to be, and so they kind of took it into their hands and did it last year without so many volunteers and all the gathering and stuff that we didn't want to do. This year, I think there are still discussions in place. There's some federal conversations about whether or not that will happen, but there's the statistics, and it's done sort of in a consistent way year over year, so you can look at the data and try to determine trends, but I think we have these discussions almost monthly at the HSPN meetings as, how many phone calls are coming in to the shelter lines, and what's the school department's numbers on number of students who are identified as homeless. There's nearly 1,200 students in New Bedford that are homeless at any given point in time. So
staggering numbers, really.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. I mean, there's about 13,000 school children in New Bedford, so a little less than 10% of them would be considered homeless. It's sort of astronomical numbers, and plagues cities across the state and the country, so it's not just our problem. But
the hard thing, too, is it seems to draw more attention, obviously, in the wintertime than it does in the summertime. In the summertime, it's warm, and I don't want to say it's not on people's radar, but in a sense, it's not, because,
Yeah, I mean, this week, we had a day that I think was like 6 degrees outside, and whether you're looking on social media or there's calls coming into our office or getting emails and stuff, everybody wants to come out and figure out a way to help people that are outside, and understandably so, right? It would be inhumane of us to not be concerned with people that don't have a place to go in those situations and maybe don't know how to access shelter, or if you're just a good Samaritan, you might not know that there's a shelter system that exists and can accommodate some of those folks. So I've seen and heard of people taking people into their houses and doing things like that, and reaching out and putting people up in hotels and so forth. Everyone wants to give back and pitch in when it's cold out, because you can imagine, the way you feel just walking to your car in the morning, or going out to take the dog for a walk, what it must be like to be out there for all night. It's tough.
And New Bedford they have the Sister Rose House, so there's really one shelter that New Bedford has. And it seems like on those days, because it's not open all the time, it's open on those cold nights. And that's full at that point in time.
Yeah, so Sister Rose has typically had the cold weather overflow shelter, so on those really cold nights or snowy nights or rainy nights, they've opened up and expanded to allow people in for the night. Again, with COVID, that's sort of limited the way that shelters work, so they're actually not doing it now. On these kind of extreme cold weather nights, individuals who are identified through some of these agencies and kind of come together gain access to motels instead, so a block of rooms is kind of set aside for that purpose, and that worked decently last year, and I think there's some improvements to it this year. Not really a sustainable long-term plan, but in the meantime, it makes sure that on a 6-degree night, the vast majority of people who want to be somewhere have a place to go. Sister Rose does have some beds kind of all the time through contracts that they have with the state, but it's a relatively small number of beds when you compare it to the number of on-street homeless people.
I'm curious as to, I mean, you were saying it's a complicated issue, and it's not so much looking at, okay, New Bedford or the network, we need to solve it. I mean, there's so many different layers, starting with the federal, the state, the city. I mean, there's a lot of different people that have to be involved to, and I don't want to say eliminate, but at least reduce it to make things happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's what you hear and what I think is, in the wealthiest, the richest nation on earth, the fact that we have this problem at all is sort of staggering. But it's not a matter of simply throwing money at it. Of course, money and resources and time and expertise really help solve the problem. And if those resources were allocated tomorrow, we would be making bigger leaps and strides in trying to solve the issue. But it goes beyond that. There are folks that are living on the street that don't want to go into shelter or don't want to move into an apartment or live in a home. They want to be in their situation, and then it's a question: is that a mental health concern, or is that a choice that they're making of their own free will? And in that case, what are your values? What do you think about whether or not people should have the right to do that or make the choice to do it? So it's difficult. You can't just it takes a lot of different good ideas to come together and work at the same time. So, just give you an example of a situation of someone who might have a substance abuse disorder, might be experiencing homelessness sort of intermittently. Maybe they have somewhere that they've lived, but they kind of get thrown out of there, and they end up on the street for a few days at a time, and then they go back and forth, and they've lived this life for a decade or so. And in the course of doing that, they've been kind of worn down by it, right? So they're disconnected from the workforce. They don't have necessarily means of earning an income or the workforce skills that would be necessary. They might not have the sort of the wherewithal to hold a job, even if they were able to get one. And then they've got this substance abuse disorder, which is a huge barrier to success. You can't just put that person in an apartment and say, we've solved the problem, right? Yeah. That's some models say that that's what you're supposed to do, and for some people you need to take a chance and give them that stability, but other folks need access to treatment, and they need access to job training, and then they need access to income.
As you're getting to that's what I'm thinking too. Yeah. I mean, when you deal with the substance abuse folks, you've got to deal with the substance abuse, and then you've got to deal with all those other things, which is why, as you were saying, it's a complicated issue because, I mean, you mentioned the person who, maybe giving you your coffee in the morning. They're working 40 hours a week.
Yeah.
But they don't have enough money. Theoretically, what do you do with that?
Yeah. That's, I think, as the economy changes and as the housing market has changed, you're seeing those sort of full-time workers, the quote-unquote working poor, they're sort of pushed into the category of not having a stable place to live. In New Bedford, up until fairly recently, you could get a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment for $1,000, $800 a month, and working a minimum wage job, or maybe 2 jobs even, you could put things together and get the bills paid. And that's changing now. It's really difficult to find an apartment for less than $1,500 a month, and
that's a 1 bedroom.
And that's a small unit in a place that maybe you don't want your grandmother to live, But to the extent that those are available, They're even highly competitive, so landlords are reviewing all these applications and so forth. And if you're a person working at Dunkin' Donuts, you might not have 3 times the rent and income every month, even with minimum wage going up and all that stuff. So it makes it difficult for any real single person or a person with an entry-level job to afford to live independently. So if you can imagine how bad it is for that person who's been living on and off the streets for the last 10 years and has a substance abuse disorder, and they're working their way back into society and trying to progress. If it's bad for the person that's working a full-time job, it's even worse for that person. They've got a lot to figure out. So there's different levels of intensity in the supports that need to be provided to folks, but it varies.
There's different ages too, correct? I mean, it runs the gamut.
Yeah. We see problems with youth homelessness. Particularly young adults. There are some folks who come out of the foster care system. They sort of age out of that system. So imagine that you're a young man. You just got through this foster care system. You're kind of out on your own. Where do you live? Where do you start? What do you do? It's difficult. So there's a youth shelter in the city, but with a fairly minimal number of beds. It's the work that they do is fantastic, but there's more people struggling with that. And again, when housing prices were a little bit more affordable, it wasn't so visible a problem because even that kid would find a job somewhere and figure out how to cover $700-800 a month for a 1-bedroom unit, or rent a room somewhere with somebody else, or room up with a pal. So those options are even more limited now, and landlords are being very choosy. So they might not even want to rent to 2 or 3 19-year-olds that come to them and want to room together.
And back in the day when you were a kid, you could do that. You could get a couple of your buddies and have a 3-bedroom and share the cost of the apartment.
Yeah. So now they say, well, bring me your pay stubs and the pay stubs of your 2 buddies, and then I'm going to run your credits, and I'm going to check to make sure you've never been evicted before in a public database, and if you pass all that stuff, and then I have 80 other applications to review, maybe you got a shot at it. And by the way, to apply, maybe you're going to pay me $40 too. So it's the deck is really stacked against people who are trying to break out and live independently. I've talked to people who have full-time jobs and are maybe doing everything right to be on that road to recovery, and they've advanced to almost the last step, which is independent living, and they just can't string it together right now. When we have these conversations and these sort of policy debates, the people up in the Boston area aren't all that sympathetic to us either, because while we might complain that the apartment's $1,500 a month or $1,700 a month, they go, oh yeah, well, it's $3,000 up here, so really that's cheap where you are.
Everything's relative, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
We are talking with Josh Amaral. He is the chair of the New Bedford Homeless Service Providers Network. I'm curious, as you look at it, is there one particular issue that would, out of all these things we're talking about, mental health, substance abuse, the working poor, is there one issue to address right off the bat that would, I don't want to say alleviate, but would certainly open the spigot, if you will, to help people? Is it housing? Is it the substance abuse? Or I don't know what it is, but I'm curious, is there one that dominoes could start falling if you could work at it?
Yeah, it's tricky because, as we talked about, the helping people is broad. So there's helping sort of the working poor people, and then there's working the people who need these intense supports to get out of on-street homelessness, right? I would say the most impactful thing that could happen right now in our area is to increase the supply of housing for people who need a place to live for about $1,000 a month, or $1,200 a month, or $800 a month.
And what does that mean, though? I mean, you really can't hope for an independent person who owns a triple deck or whatever to do that. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
I think we need different strategies, right? So there's been relatively little housing development in the city over the past 10 years or so, at least. So there's some projects that are coming in the sort of the downtown area, the North End area, that have 50 units in it, and will have 12 of the units set aside for quote unquote affordable housing. There's this concept of workforce housing that gets discussed in other places, because there's sort of a stigma attached to the phrase affordable housing, right? When we think affordable housing, we think of some of the developments in the city. We think of paying 30% of your income in rent as opposed to a market rate unit.
But what is the definition of affordable housing right now, from your standpoint?
Yeah. So when I hear affordable housing, I actually sometimes I call it capital A affordable housing. Right. It's a government type program. There are tax credits for developers for developing these units, and then they need to rent them out below market levels. Sometimes they're rented out for based on like an income-based plan. So if you make $1,000 a month, that'd be low, but if you make $1,000 a month, you pay 30% of that in your rent, so you'd pay $300 a month in rent. In other cases, that might mean, we've determined the market rate for that unit is $1,200, and you pay 80% of that. So basically, it's an all-encompassing category.
There's different.
Anything less than what the market says. And I would argue that right now we need more of those units that are slightly below the market, but not necessarily those that are deeply subsidized. So deeply subsidized meaning, housing authority type units, public housing, what we consider to be public housing. New Bedford has a good number of units in that sense, and I'm sure they would argue that they could use more, and I wouldn't oppose that per se, but I think the focus needs to be on those people who are working full-time jobs and maybe make $18 an hour and can't find a place to live.
Is that where do you think most of the people are? When we talk about homelessness, are most of those people the working poor, do you think?
I think so. I think they're harder to count.
Exactly.
By definition, right? Because they might not be, sleeping on the stoop, right? They might be sleeping at a friend's house tonight, and then a different friend's house tomorrow night, and maybe they got to spend a night in a car, and maybe they take a piece of their check and they get a room over at the motel for a couple nights, and they're showering at the YMCA. I mean, this is a significant block of people in the city that live that way, and I think if you could sort of, by providing more housing opportunities to those folks, if you could sort of clear them out of the way and get them to a safe and affordable place, then you have so much more time and energy to devote to those who need all of the resources to get there. So the folks that have more intense needs. The service providers like us, we're inundated with requests. I mean, at PACE alone, right, we do rental assistance, and we've spent much of the last year and a half processing an extreme volume of rental assistance, more than, I think we're probably about $2 million in rental assistance that we've doled out in that time. And if you were to have people living in affordable situations, it would free up all the providers to spend more time on, the person with panhandling, the person who's got substance abuse issues, the person who needs mental health
because they
connections.
need more services than the person who's, quote unquote, the working poor.
Yeah.
They may not have a substance abuse problem or a mental health issue or what have you. They just need a place to live.
Yeah.
What about, and sort of put this in tangent, you were talking about the 1,200 kids in New Bedford public schools that are in a house or a permanent place to live. Where does that work? Is that part of the working poor, or are those kids on their own in a lot of cases?
I'm sure that runs the full gamut there too, but I would hazard a guess that a lot of them are in that sort of working poor situation. One of the key definitions, things to think about, youth homelessness is defined a little bit differently than adult homelessness. So adults who might be sleeping on a friend's couch are not counted as homeless. They're considered housed. But kids who are sleeping on a friend or a relative's house, or they're doubled up with another family, are considered homeless. So I'm not really sure exactly how to explain that, but that's the reality we live in. And so I would say a lot of the working poor families find themselves in those situations rather than on the street or in the car. Some certainly do, and we want to help them as soon as we can and get them out of that situation. But almost just as concerning is someone who doesn't have a place of their own that they can depend on.
And the other thing too is there are some, I'm sure, that do have, maybe they have their own place, but it's not conducive to a family environment. You have one bedroom and four siblings.
Sure, yeah.
So theoretically, are you homeless? No, but is it a good a good situation.
Or even health and safety wise, I mean, there are unfortunately some landlords in the world who would like to collect rent and put $0 into maintaining or keeping up with properties. And with the housing market being as difficult as it is right now, some people are hesitant to call their landlord to say, hey, the sink is leaking, or there's mold over here, or I've got this issue, because they worry that they'll be retaliated against, that they'll lose even this suboptimal situation that they've got now, and they'll be back out there looking for a new place to live in an environment that's really hard to find one. So landlords will say, you know what, hey, I know that's a problem over there for you, but you're just going to have to deal with it. And people don't have a whole lot of recourse in those situations. Of course they do, but they don't feel that they do.
Right. We got a couple minutes left, but I just want to give you a chance for sort of the last word. Is what sort of programs or processes are you looking at, is the network looking at, just for this year and going forward right now? Is there anything policy-wise or anything that you guys are looking at that you want to hope to implement in the not-too-distant future?
Yeah, sure. So we've had some conversations. I think as difficult as the pandemic has made a lot of the work that we do, it's also forced us to look and think about things a little differently. So I mentioned a little while ago, we over the years have used the Sister Rose shelter as the cold weather overflow shelter in the winter months when weather gets bad, and that became kind of untenable in the last couple of years because of COVID. So we've moved to this motel model, and there are some pros and cons to that. Operationally, I think it might be a little bit neater. But when you think about the services provided to people, it leaves something to be desired in that, you go into a motel room and the door closes and you're in there, and you're not connected to services in the same way.
Correct,
right?
Right.
So we've attempted a few things to try to bridge that gap. There's a gathering center at PACA, which is going to be operational throughout the whole winter, Monday through Friday from 4 to 7 p.m. And people can kind of go there and gather, and they stay warm, and they get connected with the different services that they might be interested in or need. And the motel is sort of a secondary component of that. So there's still a connection. We're still kind of aware of what's going on. But I think it sort of makes obvious the need for a larger conversation about how the shelter system works. And do we have adequate capacity in the city for the needs that we have? Is there a better way to bring all of our service providers together, not just at a monthly meeting, but in a physical location to connect people with the services that they might need? So I would advocate for more attention paid to that area, more planning, and really trying to figure out, do we have what we need? And I suspect the answer is no. And how do we get what we need?
Right.
And do that in a really thoughtful way, because there are various policy perspectives on this stuff, and all of them have value, but it's a problem worth really working at and solving, and making sure that New Bedford is doing the right stuff. I think the people that live here deserve it. The city has done a great job in a lot of different respects, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing just as great a job in this area.
Is there, for somebody who's watching, is there a number, or for somebody who's watching, or somebody who knows somebody that's homeless, is there a number to reach out to people, or people can reach out to and say, hey, we need some help?
Yeah, so there's a couple simple steps, I would say. One, you go to nbhspn.com. That website has just about everything I've talked about today is on there, and a full resource listing and the phone numbers of the shelters and so forth to call. People could also call the city's Office of Housing and Community Development, and they'll connect people with the right place. There used to be a kind of a handy 1-800 number for people to call looking for shelter beds, but that system's changed a little bit as well. So I would say, go online, you can call the city, you could call us at PACE, and we'll direct you to the right place too. Our phone number is 508-999-9920. But the website, NBHSPN, has a lot of different resources out there. So if you know someone who might be struggling with homelessness, or you're just trying to help someone get connected, I would start there, look at what's available, and if it takes any more than that, someone can find me. I'm pretty easy to find. So.
Josh Amaral, our guest. Thanks so much for coming in. Appreciate it. Good discussion.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate being here.
That's going to do it for this edition of A Conversation With. I'm Jim Marshall of the New Bedford Cable Network. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon.